Okay, Jan Babu, 2305. Here we go. Okay, we're white, e4. Let's go. e6. All right, so we're facing a French. I'm going to adhere to my promise, which is to play essentially my main lines from here on out in the speedrun, and we're facing the Rubenstein French. Now, the Rubenstein French can occur via two principal move orders. The first is the Tarrasch, and of course the second is, if you're a knight c3 player, you also have to know how to play against d takes e4. So the Rubenstein French is an incredibly solid option for black. It's very, very hard to break down. And white has a litany of setups that you can adopt. There's sort of more classical ways of playing this line with white. Like, if you don't know anything about this position, you're very likely to play, knight f3, and then black plays knight f6. Then, typically you take it and you go like bishop f1 to d3. But the classical setup, I think, promises little to no advantage for white. And I'll kind of give you a bit of an outline of why that is after the game. So in the last 15, 20 years, grandmasters have developed more enterprising options for white that involve, certain subtle move orders that don't allow black to as easily contest the center with c7, c5. I'm going to play one of those lines in this game. I'm just trying to decide which one I want to play. There's maybe 3 or 4 of them. So let me think about this for a second. I think, okay, so disclaimer, I don't know this line that well, but we're going to start with knight f3, which is essentially de rigueur for, the entry point to all of this. I don't know if there's any other feasible moves here other than knight f3. I don't think so. I think almost everybody plays knight f3. And the big jumping off point is after knight f6, knight f6. This is like the tabia. Here, white has maybe 5 or 6 possible setups. I've played g3 in the past, which is a pretty good positional line. I won a nice game in this line, OTB. Again, bishop d3 is the classical move, but I think it's the least promising of the recent possibilities. The move that I know has a very good reputation among top GMs is this weird move c3. Well, it's not a weird move, but it's not a move that might seem particularly imposing. It's the move c3. And it's easy to misinterpret this move and think that it's purely positional. I'm just trying to reinforce the pawn. That is what white is trying to do, but a big component of this move is that queen a4 check is a major idea in a lot of these positions. And in general, as long as the king remains on e8, one of white's main tactical ideas involves quickly developing the pieces to this a4 e8 diagonal and putting significant pressure before black has a chance to complete their development. Okay, so c5. Now I have to remember the move, so just give me a second. I'm pretty sure that the main move is knight e5. I'm pretty sure that the main move is knight e5, but I don't remember it with 100% certainty. It might also be bishop e3, or maybe there's 2 moves. I know that bishop e3 is a move, and I know that knight e5 is also a move. What shall we play? Okay, let's go bishop e3. Bishop e3 looks very nice. Yeah, it's a developing move. It puts pressure on c5. And we are just trying to play dc. That's the threat of this move, is to play dc and to win a pawn. Now, if black plays cd, then we often recapture with the bishop. And the position resembles an Alpen Sicilian. There's a great deal of similarity if you draw a sort of opening Venn diagram between certain lines of the Alpen Sicilian and this particular line of the Rubenstein French. It's actually a very similar pawn structure. And in the Alpen, there's a line where white does this exact same thing, plays bishop e3, and then tries to position not a knight on d4 as you might be used to, but actually a bishop. Bishops in the center can be very, very powerful, particularly here. One benefit of recapturing with the bishop is that then the knight can drop into e5. I'm just going to check if this guy's... okay, typically he doesn't play 15 plus 10 games. Typically our opponent plays blitz and bullet. So probably he wanted to get a speedrun game in. No, I'm always just curious, what our opponents are rated in the blitz pool. Okay, knight d5. So knight d5 is a very standard response in such positions to bishop e3. And the idea is very straightforward. If now we play d takes c5, it's very easy to observe that black plays knight takes e3. Now, we can trade queens, and that might appeal to newer players because black is deprived of castling rights. But as you probably know, when the queens are off the board, that is a lot less significant, right? Making the king move. And the problem is after f takes e3, bishop takes c5, not only has black recaptured the pawn, but we are left with a very poor pawn structure, and black has the bishop pair. So dc is out of the question completely. Another tempting move that I think is not effective is bishop b5 check immediately, which is ineffective for the same reason that queen a4 check doesn't do anything. Black just plays bishop d7, and you're essentially helping black develop. So I think this is the perfect time to situate a knight on e5. I think this is where we should play knight e5. And the purpose of this move, apart from just sort of centralizing the knight, is also to prepare bishop b5 check, and in some situations to prepare queen a4 check. In both cases, bishop d7 is no longer possible. So notice that if we play queen a4 and black plays bishop d7, we play knight takes d7, queen takes d7, and then the bishop comes out to b5 and we win the queen. This is the direct threat created by the move knight e5. Yeah, very common idea in the Rubenstein. And I'm sort of, we'll check after the game, but I'm pretty sure that this is still a theoretical position. I don't know it for either side, so I'm flying blind here a little bit, but all of our moves appear to be quite sensible. So I don't think that we're in a great deal of danger here with white. And the Rubenstein is not for everybody. I mean, black's position is very cramped. Black has to know a lot of theory, but if you know how to respond to all these dangerous sidelines, I think the Rubenstein comes pretty close to equalizing. And if you're a black player who is on the lookout for a solid alternative to whatever you play, Georg Meyer, which is a name that I think most people watching on YouTube probably have come across. He's a German grandmaster, 2680 or so at his peak. He is one of probably the world's leading specialists on the Rubenstein. He's played it his whole life, and he plays it exclusively. He's one of the only grandmasters who plays the Rubenstein French exclusively with the black pieces. There are some other GMs who play the Rubenstein as one of their openings, like Varuzhin Akobian, Armenian-American GM. But Meyer has developed a lot of the theory from the black side in the Rubenstein. He's responsible for a lot of the ideas that have essentially revived this system. Anyways, it's a bit of a diatribe, but I like to give history behind openings, and the leading proponents kind of give you a sense of what you should study if you are interested in learning an opening. A6, very good move. So A6 obviously prevents bishop b5 and takes the sting out of queen a4 check, because thereafter bishop d7 takes, we no longer have bishop b5. Not because of a takes b5, that would drop the rook in the corner, but of course the queen would take on b5 and we lose a piece. So what are the options available to us here? Well, one thing to do is to play d takes c5. Unfortunately, I think black can still get away with knight takes e3, okay? And the reason why, this is a little bit of a convoluted calculation. If you can follow along in your head, dc knight takes e3, queen takes d8, king takes d8. Now, knight takes f7 check doesn't work, because the moment we capture the rook, black basically does the same thing to our rook. And remember that we're down a minor piece, because black is captured on e3 and we haven't recaptured. So after dc knight takes e3, queen takes d8, king takes d8, you might be attracted to f takes e3. And you might say, well, black doesn't have time to recapture the pawn on c5. And so we, in turn, get the opportunity to secure that pawn with b4. And that is, I think, a viable way to play. And we will be a pawn up in the resulting position. But in return for this pawn, black has the bishop pair, and our pawn structure is very seriously damaged. So it's a bit of a hard position to assess. Something to think about, d takes c5 here. Let me think about this. dc, takes fe, king e8, b4, and then the knight from e5 can drop back to c4 and then later to b6, which is a really attractive idea, actually. Yeah, I think white is better there. The alternative here is to do nothing and to just play one of those, just standard moves like bishop to d3, because knight takes e3, f takes e3 is not necessarily something to fear. And the reason it's not something to fear is because the d4 pawn will be very well secured. And after we castle kingside, we will have an immediate attack on the f7 pawn. And coupled with our bishop on d3, which will aim at h7, black's king will experience long-term problems there. Now, I should point out that queen a4 check here is not bad because of b5. That's not the idea, because b5 runs into bishop takes b5 check. And you should always be aware of this idea as long as the rook on a8 is undefended. The problem with queen a4 is black plays bishop d7. And yeah, we can trade everything on d7, but that's basically just a draw. Bishop e2, a little bit passive. I don't like bishop e2. Too passive. I am leaning toward playing dc, but I'm not sure. I'm genuinely not positive that that's the best move. But we're going to give it a shot. And it's going to lead to a very interesting endgame if black plays knight takes e3, which is far from forced. And while bishop d3, I think, is more fun, at this stage in the speedrun, I'm trying to play like maximally similar to how I would play in a classical game. And probably in a classical game, my intuition says that we should try DC. And also we're posing black with a dilemma, right? Black now has to decide whether to take on e3 or not. Really interesting position. I think this is going to be an interesting game against a good opponent. Okay. So yeah, we've just played pawn takes pawn. Now, another benefit of this move, and you might say, well, the drawback of this move is that it weakens the support. Well, it loses. The knight on e5 loses its support. But on the other hand, we open up the d4 square, which can be a very nice parking spot for the bishop. Right? If our bishop moves into d4, not only is it securing the knight and securing the pawn, but it's also, potentially aiming at the g7 pawn. So if black plays a move like bishop e7, for instance, right, and just doesn't do anything, doesn't engage, we could respond with bishop d4, and then black loses the ability to take our bishop in the future. Also, note that anytime black plays f6 in such positions, you always have this queen h5, g6, knight takes g6 trick. So I'm never worried about black pushing our knight away like this. At least not until black castles kingside. It is September, so if you like my content and you want to support, you are already very supportive by watching, but if you're watching this on YouTube and you enjoy this content, you feel like it helps you improve, that subscribe button helps me keep putting this kind of stuff out. So thank you to everybody for all of your support. I'm going to play queen takes d8 and f takes c3. So our opponent took a very long time on this decision, which is a good sign. I think this is a sign that they're not totally sure whether to go for this line or not. Okay, so what's going on in this position? Let's try to deconstruct. How do I look at a position like this? Like, what do I see when we get into this endgame, right? Well, first of all, concretely, we're threatening knight takes f7. That is the reason why this whole thing works. Otherwise, if black had played bishop takes c5 here, we would never go for this. Black has to waste the tempo to move the king back. And black has to move the king back because there is literally no other way to defend the f7 pawn. Black can't play f6 because there's still knight f7. Okay? Now, our pawn structure is not terrible. I think visually it's quite bad, and there is a weak pawn on e3. But that pawn on e3, it's weak technically because it's isolated, but black can't really attack it easily. Black doesn't have the firepower that allows him to attack this pawn easily. What do we do after king e8? Well, it's an instructive moment because I think some people might be tempted by the move c6. And you might say, well, these c pawns are doubled. Let's undouble our pawn by playing c6. But if you calculate concretely, I think c6 has more drawbacks than benefits because what would happen is after the trade on c6, that knight resulting on c6 would be very misplaced. And black would be able to play a move like bishop to b7. And the last thing that we would want to do is give this light squared bishop, this French bishop, a, full diagonal to work with. So we're not just playing to keep our extra pawn, we're also playing against black's bishops. We're playing to keep these bishops passive, and as long as we keep them passive, the impact of black's bishop pair is reduced. That is why we want to play b4 and create this pawn chain in order to keep the dark squared bishop at bay. Should black play a5, two things happen. The first is that we could play a3 and meet a takes b4 with c takes b4. The second is that we get our own parking spot for our bishop, so I'm not worried about that. Okay, king e8 b4. Yeah, white is better. Now, let's consider the optimal spots for our minor pieces. We have two minor pieces, right? The knight and the bishop. e5 is a good temporary spot, but it's not a stable spot. Should black play f6 here, we will definitely play knight c4. This should be a no-brainer to everybody watching because we have this juicy, juicy square on b6. Potentially, we have a square on d6, but that would obviously lead to a trade. And I don't know if we would necessarily want a pawn on d6 because that would be more of a weakness than a strength. Yeah, probably black should play g6. But if black plays g6 and bishop g7, then the d6 square is opened up completely for us. So we would have to tread very carefully because g6 actually creates a huge threat of bishop g7, right? Because there, if we drop our knight back, we drop c3 with tempo. Bishop e7 is a very similar move. He's trying to get the bishop to f6, and we have to address that immediately. how do we address that? How do we address the threat of bishop f6? Well, we can address it by not addressing it. We can just castle, and we can play bishop f6, knight c4, and sack the pawn on c3. But I don't think that sacrifice is warranted. We play knight b6 in that position, but black just goes rook b8, and we're at a dead end. Yeah, that knight is very nice, but we're not actually winning any material. So I think the only way for us to effectively address this, we can go from either end. We can go and defend c3, so we can play rook c1 or king d2, or we can remove the knight from e5 so that bishop f6 doesn't come with tempo. Okay? I think it's worth starting with knight c4 because we're going to play this move anyway. It's worth starting with knight c4 because, logically speaking, whenever black plays bishop f6, this is going to be our move. So starting with this move gives us more flexible options if black plays bishop f6. Also, I'm trying to discourage black from playing bishop f6 because knight d6 comes in with tempo. So that's an additional worry that black has to consider before playing bishop f6. And I'm looking at our opponent's clock and I'm seeing, okay, 6.5 minutes. If we can milk that down to like 3, then the clock becomes a serious consideration here. Yeah, our opponent really taking his time. Notice that it's interesting, black really can't move these pawns. So this weird construction, which I should say arises out of a lot of different openings, this c5, b4, c3 thing, is very good at winding down any potential counterplay on the queen side. As long as we can keep that intact, I think we're in very good shape. Okay, so this is hard to explain, but I actually think we should hold off on knight d6 check. Why? Because after king e7, first of all, we're helping black potentially connect his rooks. And second of all, it's like the kinetic versus potential energy that I've talked about in previous streams, where as long as the knight is on c4, its options are open. We can go to b6, or we can go to d6. In some cases, we could even go to a5. We don't want to commit to a placement before we have to. Like knight d6 isn't going anywhere. We can play this move whenever we want to. And I want to wait a little bit longer for black to sort of put his cards on the table, if that makes sense. So we're going to start with king d2 in order to secure this pawn. Why am I playing king d2 and not rook c1? Well, the typical advice is that you shouldn't tie down your heavy pieces to like a menial task. And this is a great illustration of that. Rook c1 would be a very bad use of our resources. I might say, well, isn't the king the most valuable piece? Well, it is, but it's also the piece that's not really participating in the game yet. So a great spot for the king would be out of the way on c2, where it would be defending the c3 pawn, but also away from the d files. That rook d8 is really not that dangerous. Okay, so I think to find a good move here, we need to ask ourselves what black's next move is going to be. Black's next move is likely to be rook d8 check, but in itself, that is not a dangerous move. A very good learning moment, I think, for newer players. Like, don't just be afraid of a move because it looks like a scary check. Why is rook d8 check not a scary check? Well, because we're able to shift our king over to c2. What we really need to be paying attention to is this bishop on c8. How is black going to go about developing that bishop? Well, most likely black is going to go bishop d7 and bishop c6 and try to get it to the long diagonal. So what I think we should do is start with bishop e2. I think it's very important for us to immediately get this bishop out of the gates in order to meet bishop d7 with bishop f3 and essentially beat black to the long diagonal, right? And a lot of these endgames really do hinge on concrete details, like who can get their pieces to a particular square first or set of squares first. Black could also be playing e5, but that would create a serious complex of light square weaknesses in the center, and it wouldn't really change what we did. We would still play bishop f3 and put serious pressure on the b7 pawn. Also possible would have been to play bishop d3 and then bishop e4, but I like the f3 square because it's a defended square. I like the f3 square because it's a defended square. Defended, I mean, by a pawn, of course. So interesting subtlety. Black can play bishop d7 here, right? And the move bishop d7 carries a potentially unpleasant threat of either bishop a4 check, and then potentially the only thing stopping black from infiltrating to d2 would be this relatively flimsy knight on c4. Not a situation I would necessarily want to allow. So in response to bishop d7, apart from bishop f3, who can tell me a possible prophylactic move that we could consider? There's actually several prophylactic moves that we could consider. Yeah, I'm talking about the move a4, essentially advancing the pawn and preventing the bishop from accessing both the b5 and a4 squares. Now, you might say, well, doesn't that defeat the whole purpose of what we just did? Black could play bishop c6, but then we meet bishop c6 with bishop f3, immediately disarming Black's bishop. And this other bishop on f6 is completely, its influence is very scant, because all it's doing is staring at this pawn, and this pawn is incredibly well defended. So this bishop on f6 is actually a terrible piece. And this is a good lesson in not just looking at a piece and looking at how many squares it controls, but really understanding what a piece actually does. What does it do for your position? And the answer here is nothing. The bishop does nothing. Also possible is to play knight b6, by the way. But again, I like the way that this knight is placed here. I think we should keep it on c4 as long as we can, and only decide on a placement, a little bit later. Let's go a4, as we planned initially. The other thing I like about the move a4 is that later on we can obviously play b5 and we can start advancing our pawn majority. Okay? So, yeah, I think Black's position is probably borderline lost here. I would maybe say, I don't know. Okay. Yeah, bishop f3, obviously. Bishop f3, obviously. No, this is not resignable in a GM level game. I would definitely not even consider resigning here with Black. But if Magnus was sitting across from me, I probably would. So now we move to the next stage of the game. This previous stage, which lasted, I would say, 6 moves, right, was aimed at completely disarming Black's bishops. We have succeeded in that task. We have disarmed both of Black's bishops. Now the final stage, I think, has to be converting our extra pawn and actually making something of it. We shouldn't generate a follow-up move because it all depends on what Black does on his next move. Like if Black takes on f3, that changes the pawn structure. Black might play rook a c8, something like that. But there's many ways that we can go about playing this position. Like we can try to get b5 in, but the move b5 is very, very risky because it leaves the c5 pawn undefended. So if Black plays in this position rook a c8, I definitely think we should not insist on pushing b5. We can also work on controlling the d-file, so like a move like rook hd1 could be considered. Of course, we have to be very, very careful because we don't want to blunder a4 with a pin. And as somebody in the chat suggested, you could consider the move king b3 in some cases. Although once again, king b3 yields the d3 square. So whenever you're holding your opponent's pieces back like this, you have to be very, very careful not to accidentally give up a square. It's very, very easy to blunder that. Like you just, you miss the forest for the trees. Okay, he takes f3, we take back. That's fine. And rook a c8. Yeah, I think this is the logical approach. So now that there is no longer pressure on the a4 pawn, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to play rook a d1. I think this makes the most sense by far. Again, I want people to see that I'm not rushing to jump my knight into d6 or to b6. The knight on c4 is perfectly placed. It's controlling everything, and there's no reason to move it yet. Is the exchange of rooks beneficial to white? I would say the exchange of one pair of rooks definitely is. But the point of rook d1 isn't so much to exchange rooks as it is to contest the d-file. Contesting the d-file, it challenges Black's last source of activity in this position. If we can get the d-file under control, then we can just completely focus on converting our 4-on-2 pawn majority on the king side. Also, Black is very low on time. He's under a minute because he doesn't know what to do. There's just like no moves here. Black is paralyzed. Black is completely paralyzed. g6, yeah, I mean, he basically has to resort to waiting moves. Yeah, knight a5 is possible. Let me think about this. e4 maybe? e4, e5, and f4 is interesting. Rook d6 is possible. a5 is possible. The key is not to rush here. The key is not to hurry. You won't be able to win this game in like 1 second. I'm liking the look of king b3 for now. Okay, let's start with king b3. Just moving the king a little bit closer into position, because later on, after the knight moves out of c4, we can play king c4, and maybe even prepare b5 after all. I want to bring the king a little bit closer. Okay, so our opponent is like essentially making waiting moves on the queen side, or on the king side, I guess. Now I think knight a5 is possible. Knight b6 is again possible. But I like the look of rook d6. I like the look of rook d6, which is a classic move. This is a completely classic idea where you put a piece along a certain file in order to prepare the other piece of that kind to move to that. Usually this is done with 2 rooks, of course. But you can also do this with a rook and a queen. But there's just no other squares along the d file that make any sense. I mean, rook d4 may be possible, but why even consider an exchange sack here? There's no need for that. Instead, we put it on d6. Now, what am I intending after rook takes d6? What should I capture with? The answer is the knight, right? Because capturing with a pawn gives you that temporary hit. Ooh, it's like a check. But after the king steps away, notice that the knight is actually going to be paralyzed because of the weakness of the c3 pawn. So we want to keep the pawn structure as it currently is. Takes. And we're putting pressure on our opponent's clock, which is totally legit strategy. He's got no time. Now let's bring the other rook into position, rook d1. This is the whole point of our entire approach, which is to get control of the d file. And now I think we proceed to the final stage. I'm actually going to play h3 here just to restrict our opponent's pawns and not allow any kind of activity with g4. There is no hurry. Black is not threatening to take on d6. Okay? Now, let's think about this for a second. How do I want to arrange this? King c4 is interesting, by the way. There must be some easy way here to finish this game off. Knight back to e4 is possible, but then he plays f6. We play b5. c4 is possible. a5 is possible. It's actually not quite elementary to convert this, annoyingly so. This is the hardest part of the game. Yeah, king c4 I don't love the look of because it walks into a pin. I think I know what we should do. But I don't want to give counterplay either. Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to find the clean way to win here. And it's not easy to do. I think I'm going to go knight to e4. And let me explain my logic. What is Black's biggest source of counterplay here in the long run? Well, Black's biggest source of counterplay is to create a pass pawn. This is like the answer to that question in most endgames. How does Black create a pass pawn? Well, Black plays f5 and then g4, right? So what I'm trying to do with the use of this knight is to freeze Black's kingside pawns. Why am I freezing Black's kingside pawns? Well, what that helps me do is focus on converting my pawn majority without having to worry about Black suddenly creating a pass pawn of his own. This is a slightly risky strategy because I am opening up the door for a rook trade, but my intuition tells me that the rook trade is winning for White. And there is one specific line that I calculated, which I think is very important. And that line is, what if Black plays rook d7 here? This is what I was focused on calculating. Of course, Black could push the b pawn now, but that merely plays into our hands, I think. b6, b5 should be winning for us. Okay, there we go. And here's what I calculated. Takes. Could somebody tell me what tactical move wins a pawn for White, wins another pawn for White? White to play. This is what took me 2 minutes to find. Yes, f4. We push f4 and we knock this bishop out of e5. And after the trade on f4, we take f6 with check and then we come around and take h5. But it's still not the end of the line. Because after we take the h5 pawn, who can tell me where Black can move this bishop to completely dominate the knight? Yeah, Black's bishop can drop back to e5. And in that position, we have to ensure that we can extricate the knight either through tactical means by distracting Black on the other side, or by maneuvering the king to e4 and dislodging the bishop, which is exactly what I want to do. And I think that should be the winning idea. I am going to renew my reservation this room for another 15 minutes. Takes. Here. Okay. So what's going on here? How do you look at this position? Well, here's the thing. Black is threatening to play king g6. What should White play here? What do you guys think? Do we need to rush with king e4, or do we have another tempo that we can use, for instance, to fix the situation on the queen side? I think that we should play c4. And only after king g6 do we play the move king e4. But the magic of this line is not that. The magic of this line is that after king g6, king e4, Black has this incredibly nasty move, bishop c3. And you might look at this and say, well, then we have to move the knight, and Black wins the crucial linchpin of White's entire pawn majority on b4. But after king g6, king e4, bishop c3, knight f4 comes with a check. And black has no other way to approach this knight. So this is an inevitable line. And now we win the game, because once the knight is extricated successfully, and then we play b5, our strategy is very simple. We have way too many passed pawn and extra pawn. We can even sack the knight on d5, and that should be winning, but no reason to be extravagant here. We can combine pushing the h-pawn with pushing the c-pawn, and there's too many passers. We're going to make a queen very shortly. We're going to make a queen very shortly. We can play knight d3, you can play c6, everything is winning. I think the easiest is to play c6 and create the outside passer on a6. Now, what is the general rule? The general rule is that your passed pawn should be as far away as possible from the enemy pieces. And corner pawns are the hardest to stop. Knight d3. The rest is obvious without commentary. We are heading for c6 in order to dislodge the bishop and push a7. This is the final nail in the coffin. We could have also done it through b4, but it's more elegant to do it through the center. That's it. Knight c6 and a7 is coming. And that's how we convert this advantage. Definitely not ideal, but I think that was really, really nice. That was one of the nicer games that I've played in the speedrun. Opening-wise and middle game-wise. GG. Okay, so let's analyze quickly. Yeah, so this is the Rubenstein French, named after Akiba Rubenstein, of course. When was it first played? Let's take a look. Was it first played by Rubenstein? Not necessarily, of course, as you know. It was first played in 1861 by Ignaz Kolisch. And Kolisch was considered one of the top opening experts of the 1860s. So when Kolisch wrote an article, he was also very rich. He struck it rich, I think, in like the gold industry or something. But he was one of the top players of the like 1850s and 1860s. So this first occurred in the game Paulson against Kolisch, 1861, in their match. And Kolisch played knight f6, which was the old move. Knight f6 is the old move. But after knight takes f6, there's obviously a very awkward situation for black. Either you have to take with a queen and give white a big development advantage, or you have to take with a pawn and completely ruin your pawn structure. So this line fell out of favor pretty quickly. The first time that knight d7 was played was by Albin. It was by Albin in 1890. Emanuel Lasker was the third person to play knight d7 in 1894 against Steinitz in the World Championship match. Want to hear something really interesting? So, testing your guys' attention. Not Collie. So, some people are confusing Kolisch with Collie. K-O-L-I-S-H. Want to hear something interesting? So, Kolisch was the first person to play the Rubenstein French. The first person to play knight d7 was Albin. And the tournament in which he played this was the Kolisch Memorial. What are the odds of that? So, Kolisch had died in like 1880. And in the Kolisch Memorial at Adolf Albin, who is, of course, the originator of the Albin counter gambit himself, which is e5, played knight d7 for the first time in the Kolisch Memorial. Funny coincidence. And that game continued knight f3, knight f6, and Philipp Meitner, his opponent, played bishop d3 here, which is a move. His opponent played bishop d3 here, which is an old move. It's still played sometimes. Takes, knight f6, etc. I'm sure he wasn't aware of this game when he was playing it. So anyways, knight takes f6, knight takes f6, and this is the sort of one of the critical positions in this whole line. So the most popular move, according to the database by far, as I said, is bishop d3. But this line is, I wouldn't say toothless, but it's not very dangerous anymore. Black immediately plays c5. And the way that the old people used to play it is they used to play dc, bishop c5, castles, by castles. And obviously here, the most natural move, in my opinion, is bishop g5. But after bishop g5, black plays b6 and develops this bishop to b7. Most people play queen e2 and rook d1, very tempting setup. But after queen c7, this position has occurred hundreds of times, and this is completely equal. White has not a shred of an advantage here, despite the apparent weakness of black's king, because black's bishops are aiming directly at white's king side. White can play bishop e4, but the games here mostly end in draws, because you're going to get a bunch of trades on the d-file, and black's king is much, much safer than it appears on h8. There's just no way to attack it. This is basic betting. Yeah, this is what you don't want to play with white. You don't want to just waltz into this line because you're not going to have an advantage. So there are many, many venomous systems that have been developed in recent years. After bishop d3, c5, there is this interesting move, bishop to e3. You can also play the one line that I really like is bishop e3 here. And the point of bishop e3 here is actually to prevent black from playing c5, because here, obviously, you can play dc. So this is a very interesting move as well. We're going to focus on the line that I played, which is c3. Who was the inventor of the c3 variation? So the first person to play c3 was Boleslavsky in 1947. And Boleslavsky was a Soviet GM. He was the first person to kind of understand this idea. It was played twice in 1947. So c3. c5 is the main response by far. And let me double check what the main move is here for white. Yeah, so this is interesting. I was actually correct for once. There are two moves in this position. There's knight e5, which is the most popular move. But the move that almost all of the top GMs have played recently was the one that I played in the game, which is bishop e3. Knight e5 is the more confrontational line. And after knight e5, typically black plays a6. And here, once again, there is bishop e3, and there is also queen a4 check. And this just leads to a very kind of convoluted type of battle. Bishop d7, knight d7, queen d7. But you see, most people who play this line just end up going for this endgame. And I'll be honest, this doesn't appeal to me that much. Even though white actually scores very well in this endgame, it doesn't feel to me that white is really all that much better. Yeah, you're slightly better. You've got the bishop pair. Yeah, I agree. But I wouldn't recommend this to most players. So that's one of the reasons why I don't love knight e5. I think bishop e3 keeps more options open and just a more interesting line. Okay, so bishop e3, right? In this position, the main move for black is queen c7. Yeah, knight d5 is a mistake. I think knight d5 is a... No, it's been played by some GMs. Knight d5 has been played by some GMs, but it's far from the most popular move, and apparently the engine doesn't like it. Let me turn Stockfish on for a second just to double check that. Yeah, knight d5 is an inaccuracy because of, let's see. Yeah, because of knight e5. And it's plus over minus already. This position is already terrible for black. Fascinating. So black has to play in this position the move queen c7, which is far from obvious that queen c7 is the correct move. Why is queen c7 the correct move? Well, it puts the queen in a much better spot and it protects the c5 pawn. Okay, so it actually is sensible to play queen c7 here. You're defending c5. But according to the engine, white is a little bit better after knight e5. Knight e5, a6, queen a4 check. And here's the thing. After bishop d7, knight takes d7. If you compare the two versions of the endgame, this version of the endgame is much, much better than the one we just encountered. Because here, king takes d7 runs into dc. So black has to make this very awkward recapture. We can already castle, and it should be plain to you that white has a big, big advantage in this endgame. So, of course, black can also cover with the knight, right? Black can go knight d7. Here you can go bishop to b5, which is a very, very typical idea in any line where there is direct contact with an undefended rook on a8. You should really hammer this into your head, that you should be aware of this idea. Off the top of my head, one line in which this is very important is in the Jobava London. Of course, I will give you an example from the Jobava London. There is a line in the Jobava London. c5, e3, takes, a6, knight f3, knight c6, knight e5. And in this position, you're supposed to go bishop d7, but people used to play bishop f5, and now white plays g4. And I had a game like this against Daniel Yufa. This is an old line that's pretty well known. And here, there is a very interesting idea that involves playing queen d4. And the whole point is that after e6, who can tell me how white develops a huge initiative in this position? White to play. And on this tactical detail hinges this entire variation. Queen a4 check. But what happens if black just goes queen d7? Well, this is your chance to put into practice what you just learned. Of course, it's obvious when you get to this position, but try finding this like 5 moves ago. Bishop b5, of course. And again, the rook on a8 is undefended. Black loses the exchange. If black plays b5, you still take on d5. Here, the point is not that the rook is undefended, it's defended. It's that after king e7, you get checkmated beautifully. Look at this. Diagonal checkmate. You don't even need the other bishop. It's made in 2. Okay, so that's just off the top of my head. This is an important pattern. Now, let's go back to bishop b5 in this position. What is the point of bishop b5 here? What does this actually threaten? Well, this threatens to win a pawn. It's actually quite simple. You just take everything on d7. Notice that if cd, there's knight b6 hitting the rook, important detail. You could also take in the other order. Actually, no. See, this is what's amazing about modern openings, is how much attention to detail you have to have. As a matter of fact, you have to play queen d7 here, because if you play knight takes d7 instead, black suddenly has the intermezzo b5, hitting the queen and then recapturing in a much better version. So actually, you should play queen d7. And at the end of the line, you just play dc, and you are in time, much like we did in the game, to support the pawn with b4. So if we rewind to bishop b5, black has to play c takes d4. And this happened in the recent FIDE World Cup in the game Ponomarev against Berkish. Bishop d7, queen d4. And according to the engine, white has a small but stable advantage. Why does white have a small but stable advantage? It has to do with the superior piece activity and the fact that black is very cramped, and the fact that black does not have an easy way to develop the dark squared bishop, obviously, because you will drop the g7 pawn. And, you know, black can play rook d8, but then weak castle queenside. And black is paralyzed along the d file. Why is black paralyzed along the d file? Because if black moves the bishop, we trade everything on d8 and we take f7. It's very hard for black to circumvent this problem because the e8 square is occupied by the king. So black can play f6 here, but that leads to this kind of position, which should be apparent to you is rather unpleasant for black because there's weaknesses and the king on e8 is stranded. Okay, so I actually think this is one of white's best lines. In any case, the move for black is queen c7. The engine also gives bishop e7 at a low depth, just developing the king side. But apparently after bishop b5 check, bishop d7, bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, what is the move here for white? It's d5. Oh, but yeah, d5 with an edge. Well, obviously white is better here. This is a very unpleasant position for black from a strategic standpoint because of all the weaknesses in the center. Yeah, so there is no easy way for black to solve his problems. But this position is already very unpleasant because black has to burn a tempo on a6. There is no choice. If black just nonchalantly develops, well, this check is very, very bad for black. I mean, I don't even want to analyze this position. It's clearly terrible. So black has to burn a tempo on a6, and now we just gobble up the pawn. We just freaking gobble up the pawn. It's already +2. If you can believe it, Stockfish gives +2 for white because black essentially has to take on e3. There is no choice. If black plays queen c7 here, trying to pick up the pawn, who can tell me what white's response to this move is going to be? What happens after queen c7? Yeah, it's basically losing already. Queen a4 check, right? That's the whole point. You induce bishop d7, you do the classic trade on d7, and you just stick your bishop on d4, or you can even castle. This is an even cuter move because you pin the knight, then you put your bishop on d4, and then suddenly you circle around, and then circle back to d4, and you have a stable, healthy extra pawn, and a technically winning endgame. So black is just not in time. So our opponent takes on e3, leading to this terrible, terrible endgame for black. Terrible endgame. And I think I did a pretty good job of explaining this endgame during the game, so I'm not going to like beat a dead horse. Bishop b7 is logical, knight c4 is logical, king d2, bishop b2. This is a very important move, bishop b2, because we are optimizing the placement of the bishop and we're putting it on the long diagonal. And notice that we're not afraid of the completely paper tiger check on d8. We just shift the king over. Then we play a4 prophylaxis. Bishop f3 would be very bad because of the check on a4, followed by rook d3, giving away a ton of squares. So I just want you to notice how patiently you have to play these types of technical endgames. Always ask yourself what your opponent wants. Even if the position is passive, there might be these hidden threats, and you don't want to give away counterplay for free. So a4 is kind of a no-brainer, controlling a ton of squares, and then disarming the bishop, and then contesting the d-file, and then improving the king, and then preparing to take control of the d-file from black. And again, this is an instructive moment. Now, according to the engine, c takes d6 was possible. And what's interesting is that this loses to d7 and knight b6, kind of a classical pattern. Now, what should white do in this position? Who can tell me, in this position, what is white's best move? Instructive moment. Ask yourself what black is threatening and try to prevent it. Ask yourself what black is threatening and try to prevent it. So a5 is the best move. a5 prevents b5 because of the opposite. What did black want? If you made a move like e4, black is already winning after b5 because you're dropping c3 with devastating effect. Always think prophylactically in the endgame first and foremost. How can I prevent my opponent's ideas? Black is paralyzed. And we can win by like eventually pushing our pawns in the center, like e4, e5, etc. So we decided to take with the knight and kind of keep the status quo. Then, again, prophylactic thinking, right? This was a very important moment. I thought about going to c4. And then I thought about playing something like rook d6. But after f5, suddenly black is about to create a passed pawn and things get really dicey. Again, you put the knight on a square where it prevents black from making the most of his pawn majority. Now we improve. And now it's easy. Takes, and f4. And now you use tactics to complete the circle, forcing all of this. Now, notice that if black would have played f5, this would have directly led to a losing pawn endgame, so that's not option. But you can't stop here. I had to see king d3, king e4. I had to see this because black is only 2 moves away from winning the knight and potentially even winning the game. So you use your king to dislodge the bishop. But before you do that, you play c4. Yes, probably this is also winning, but this is a lot dicier. This is a lot closer to a draw. Notice that we play king e4 with tempo, and we play knight f4 with tempo. And something I said at the beginning of the speedrun, which is that as we climb to a higher and higher rating, the margins become thinner and thinner and thinner. Notice how thin the margins of this victory were, even though I was essentially winning out of the opening. Still, when push came to shove, I had to calculate a very precise variation in order to actually complete the victory. And this is one of the things that happens as you get better at chess, is you need to walk a narrower path. You need to tread more carefully. And so your calculation becomes more important because you miscalculated a critical moment and all of your effort essentially is in vain. Okay, b5 and the game is over. So that's one of the interesting takeaways of this game, apart from thinking prophylactically. But notice at how many moments I decided to withhold my own ideas and play prophylactically. Let's count. Okay, 1, bishop e2 was a prophylactic move because we're trying to get the bishop to f3 and prevent black from getting to c6. 2, stopping bishop a4. Okay, king b3 is more of an improving move. 3, stopping g4. 4, stopping f5 and g4. And then that's basically it. So like there were 4 critical moments where I played prophylactically and disarmed all of black's ideas. And that concludes our analysis, folks. Definitely, as an e4 player against the Rubenstein French, you should play the c3 variation. Hopefully you found the analysis to be helpful. I'll just end by saying that if black does not play with c5, if black does not engage, right? If black plays bishop e7, then you play bishop d3, castles. And black can play like this, but black is much worse here because the ship essentially has sailed for black. If black suddenly plays c5 now, he loses a tempo. Black loses a tempo because he went bishop e7 and then bishop takes c5. So queen e2, and then you castle kingside, and you get basically an improved version of the classical line. Okay, so you can look at this a little bit more on your own, but my recommendation against the Rubenstein officially is to play c3. All right, guys, I think we're going to conclude here. I hope you enjoyed the game. This is a long stream, but a very productive stream. We did 2 speedrun games, so these will be out on YouTube very shortly. And that's where we are going to end. Thanks, everybody. Great match today against Matlikov as well. I'm pretty pumped. This is a good stream. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for hanging out today. I'm going to head out.